The name Supermarine is now almost inseparable from a single aircraft, the Spitfire. For many people, the two are practically synonymous. The company's identity has become so closely tied to that sleek and famous fighter that it's easy to forget that Supermarine's origins lay in a very different corner of aviation. The name itself, in fact, offers a rather obvious clue: Supermarine. It connects with something not of the land, but of the sea, and that is precisely where the company's origins came from. In its earliest years, Supermarine had very little interest in land planes at all. Its attention was firmly directed towards the development of flying boats and seaplanes, at a time when aviation itself was still in its infancy, and engineers were experimenting with almost every possible configuration of aircraft, some more successfully than others. From its first days, the company had begun experimenting with seaplane designs, attempting to establish itself in what many believed would become the dominant form of long-distance air travel. Airfields were scarce in the early 20th century, but stretches of open water were conveniently abundant, so to many designers the future seemed obvious. Aircraft would simply operate from the sea. Now, as it turned out, the future had other plans, but at the time that prediction seemed reasonable. The company's early designs, however, showed little sign of the success that would eventually follow. Their first aircraft were experimental, limited in capability, and very much products of aviation's pioneering years, which was a nice way of saying they were vaguely reliable and highly recalcitrant. Nevertheless, the company persisted. Throughout the 1920s, Supermarine gradually refined its approach, producing increasingly capable flying boats and amphibians. At the same time, its chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, began attracting international attention through a series of race-winning seaplanes, which became some of the fastest aircraft in the world at the time. These aircraft would eventually help shape the design philosophy that would go on to produce the Spitfire, a fighter that became so successful that it would later eclipse almost everything else that Supermarine Aviation Works would ever build. Which is somewhat ironic, because when Supermarine finally struck gold with one of their most successful aircraft in the 1930s, it wasn't a sleek racing plane or fighter aircraft at all. Instead, it was a rather curious-looking amphibian. It was chunky, oddly proportioned, looked decidedly old-fashioned, and it would go on to become the most widely produced and the most beloved seaplane that the company would ever build. Hello, I am Christopher Rex Emerson, and today we are looking at the venerable, often forgotten, and grossly underappreciated Supermarine Walrus. And yes, I know this is an aircraft that a lot of people have been requesting for a long time, so I hope you found the wait worth it. Now, at first glance, the Walrus looked positively archaic. With its biplane wings, its boat-shaped hull, and struts running here, there, and everywhere, it appeared to belong to a much earlier decade. Yet, appearances could be deceiving. This stocky little thing would go on to become the Royal Navy's standard ship-launched reconnaissance plane during the Second World War, serving not only Britain, but several members of the Commonwealth as well. In many ways, the Walrus represents the final chapter in the long story of ship-launched aircraft outside those used aboard aircraft carriers in the British Navy. For the past couple of decades, broadly speaking, navies had relied on catapult-launched seaplanes for observation, reconnaissance, gunnery spotting, and rescue work. It was a practice that had stretched all the way back to the First World War when aircraft first went to sea. But by the end of the Second World War, that era was well and truly coming to a close. New technologies, particularly radar and shipborne helicopters, would gradually make the catapult-launched seaplane a thing of the past, and the Walrus would effectively see out that entire transition. During its long service life, the aircraft proved remarkably versatile. Walruses conducted reconnaissance patrols, gunnery spotting for naval artillery, anti-submarine patrols, and a variety of other maritime duties. But over time, The role that the Walrus became most famous for, and is most fondly remembered for, is a role that it was never originally intended for, and that was air-sea rescue. The aircraft's amphibious design and reinforced hull allowed it to land directly on the water, even in rough sea conditions, and it was able to pick up downed airmen who might otherwise have had little chance of surviving. During a war that saw thousands fighting upon or over the seas that were surrounding Britain, and across the vast stretches of ocean elsewhere, this ability proved invaluable. When the final Walrus rolled off the production line in 1944, the type had already been in service for more than a decade, and at this point it had saved the lives of thousands of airmen. Over 700 aircraft had been built, and the Walrus had become a familiar and often welcome sight across the fleets of the Royal Navy and its allies. It might not have the svelte glamour of the Spitfire, but during the war, the Walrus was equally as beloved. For many downed airmen struggling in the cold waters of the sea, the sight of a walrus circling overhead meant one simple, reassuring thing. It meant that someone had come looking for them, and very often it meant that they were going to be going home safe. The story of the Walrus begins in the 1920s. Since its earliest days in 1914, the company that would later become Supermarine Aviation Works had focused much of its attention on the development of flying boats and seaplanes. One of its earlier examples was the rather adorably named Supermarine Baby, which was a compact, single-seat flying boat fighter that was developed during the First World War. Not long afterwards came the Supermarine Channel, which holds an important place in aviation history as being the world's first commercially operated flying boat. The aircraft achieved several pioneering milestones in early civil aviation, demonstrating that seaplanes could serve practical transport roles beyond military use. During the 1920s, the company achieved even greater success with the Supermarine Southampton, which was a large, twin-engined flying boat that became one of the most important and widely used British flying boats of the decade. At the same time, Supermarine was gaining international attention in a very different theatre. Throughout the 1920s, the company produced a remarkable series of high-performance racing seaplanes, notably the S4, the S5, and the S6, which were entered in the prestigious Schneider Trophy air races. These aircraft were the work of the company's chief designer, Reginald Joseph Mitchell, and they represented some of the most advanced aeronautical engineering and power plant developments of their time. It's often suggested that this lineage of high-speed racing planes eventually led to the development of the Supermarine Spitfire, and it's something I've discussed in a previous video that focuses on Supermarine's racing seaplanes. The same designer, R.J. Mitchell, was responsible for both, and certain elements of aerodynamic thinking developed during the Schneider Trophy years would later reappear in his famous fighter. But despite these achievements, Supermarine's fortunes during the interwar period were far from rosy. For every successful aircraft, the company had also absorbed the cost of several failures. A number of expensive prototypes, both civil and military, had been rejected by potential buyers, while others were lost in accidents during testing. Winning international races brought valuable publicity, and the prize money certainly helped things, but it was not enough to guarantee long-term financial stability. By the late 1920s, Supermarine's finances were under considerable strain. So, when the Royal Australian Air Force expressed interest in a new catapult-launched observation seaplane, the company seized the opportunity, and the Supermarine Walrus would come into existence from this decision. Now, as a bit of additional context, the Royal Australian Air Force had already purchased 9 Supermarine Seagull Mark III flying boats in the 1920s. These aircraft saw extensive use around Australia's vast coastlines. In particular, they conducted many aerial surveys, and at first they appeared to be a satisfactory solution for their needs. However, problems began to emerge when the Australians attempted to operate them from warships, launching them by catapult. The Seagull III had not been designed with this method of operation in mind. It lacked the structural provisions and reinforcements, and the equipment necessary for catapult launches in the first place, And it also proved extremely difficult to handle on the water unless conditions were perfectly calm. The type was prone to porpoising, or bouncing, where the bow would lift and fall sharply as it crested even small waves. This meant that operating the aircraft from ships could be a frustrating and unreliable and vaguely unsafe process. When used aboard vessels such as the heavy cruisers HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra, great care had to be taken when launching and recovering the aircraft. The ships often needed to locate relatively sheltered areas of water or wait for a clock calm before attempting takeoffs or recovery. Now, needless to say, this was far from ideal for a military aircraft. Machines intended for naval service were expected to operate in demanding environments and not be rendered ineffective by something as routine as a moderate swell. Thus, the Australians were after something better. The timing was fortuitous because the Australians' search for a new seaplane coincided with an important change that had occurred with Supermarine. In November 1928, Supermarine had been absorbed into the much larger industrial group which was Vickers Armstrong Limited. This merger brought the company into what was sometimes referred to as the Vickers Empire, giving its designers access to far greater financial and technical resources. When work began on the new aircraft for the Australian Air Force, which began as a private venture for Supermarine, these additional resources proved extremely valuable. Though the aircraft is today remembered as the Walrus, the project was initially known as the Seagull 5, and the design drew heavily on experience gained from earlier Supermarine flying boats, such as the Seagull 3, but also the Supermarine Viking. The intent was to draw on lessons learned from these earlier designs and to produce a modern, and more importantly, rugged military seaplane, one that could operate reliably from warships and handle the demanding conditions of naval service. And, despite its somewhat old-school appearance, the resulting aircraft would prove to be remarkably advanced for its time. The new design incorporated a number of innovative features. It was to have an enclosed cockpit, improving both crew comfort and protection from the elements. It would also feature a fully retractable main undercarriage, allowing it to operate both from the water and from conventional airfields. This was a highly advanced feature for the time, and it would be the first British aircraft to reach squadron service that incorporated it. Now, this inclusion technically makes the Seagull 5 an amphibian plane, rather than just a seaplane or a flying boat. But many people in text don't bother making the distinction for one reason or another, so as the video carries on, I will mostly just refer to it as a seaplane. The aircraft's hull would be constructed entirely from metal, which was a decision intended to reduce the problems of structural deterioration that wooden flying boat hulls often suffered when operating in tropical climates. With tropical climates being a somewhat common occurrence in the northern coasts of Australia, this design choice made a lot of sense. Structurally, though, the aircraft still retained certain traditional features. The wings used stainless steel spars, but were covered with plywood and in doped fabric, and the ailerons were similarly built with metal frames and fabric coverings. The aircraft also retained a biplane configuration, which by the early 1930s was already starting to look a bit old-fashioned. But this choice was deliberate. Biplanes offered excellent low-speed handling characteristics, including low stall speeds, a short takeoff run, and good stability at slow speeds. These qualities were extremely desirable for an aircraft that would often be taking off and landing in confined areas of water. The primary disadvantage of the biplane layout was reduced speed, but for an observation and reconnaissance aircraft, this was considered an acceptable compromise. Now, one of the more distinctive features of the new design was its engine mounting arrangement. Previous versions of the Seagull had the engine installed in a tractor configuration, often with the blades spinning at a disconcerting proximity to the pilot's head, these earlier models having an open cockpit. Now, the engine was installed in a pusher configuration. This arrangement helped to protect the propeller from damage caused by spray or waves during takeoff and landing, and it also gave the pilot a bit of peace of mind as well. It was also, originally, intended to support a modular approach to power plants, allowing the engine installation to be removed and replaced relatively easily. The original intent of this was to make the aircraft suitable for different types of engines, so that material shortages wouldn't severely impact its operational readiness. But in the end, only one other engine type appears to have been seriously considered. That was the Rolls-Royce Kestrel V12, which, if nothing else, would have changed the aircraft's looks considerably. However, this option was never adopted. Eventually, production aircraft would be powered by the newly developed Bristol Pegasus. This was a very reliable 28.7-litre 9-cylinder air-cooled radial that would become one of the most widely used British aero engines of its era. As the design matured, the aircraft began to take on its final form. The Seagull 5 measured at 37 feet 7 inches in length. It had a wingspan of 45 feet 10 inches and stood just over 15 feet tall. The crew normally consisted of 3 men: a pilot, a navigator, and a wireless operator. The wireless operator would also serve as the aircraft's defensive gunner. 2 machine guns were installed, mounted on fully transversible scarf rings. You had a forward position and an amidships position. These positions could be armed with a .303 caliber Lewis gun or a Vickers K gun, providing defensive firepower for both the forward and rear sections of the aircraft. Now, given the distance between the 2 gun positions, it is rather difficult to imagine a single crewman operating both effectively during combat, although the available documentation typically identifies the wireless operator as the primary defensive gunner. In practice, the wireless operator was usually spared the inglorious task of trying to be in 2 places at once during combat operations, as the amidships gun position was often removed and replaced with a second set of flight controls instead. These controls would be used in the event of an emergency where the pilot was incapacitated, but also during various combat operations where having the control passed over to the observer made more sense than giving it to the pilot. This was in reflection to the fact that the aircraft could carry up to 400 pounds of ordnance. The bombs could be released by the pilot, relying largely on judgment, the Mark I eyeball, and a bit of experience, or it could be aimed by another crew member using a portable bomb sight that could be mounted on the starboard side of the bow hatch. Unfortunately, I've been unable to verify just how often the portable bomb sight was used in conjunction with these second sets of controls, so I'm just going to leave that point aside and say that it's something that could be done if needed. As a final point on the general design, during early development, leading-edge slats were considered for the upper wing to improve short takeoff performance. However, later on, testing indicated that the aircraft would already possess excellent short takeoff and landing characteristics, and the British Admiralty ultimately judged that the slats were unnecessary. However, they do appear in early prototype drawings. With the design largely settled upon, construction of the first prototype began in 1930. However, the Seagull 5 was not the only aircraft competing for the attentions of Supermarine's industrial capacity. The British Royal Air Force had also commissioned new flying boats, and despite ordering theirs later, they were of course given priority over the Australians, because of course they were. It wasn't until Royal Australian Air Force representatives in Britain started putting on the pressure and potentially threatening assault using drop bears that serious resources were allocated to its construction. Although, even then, it wouldn't be until the 21st of June 1933, almost 3 years after approval, that the prototype was ready for its maiden flight. This was unfortunately a result of the fact that the entire thing began as a private venture by Supermarine, and so despite the insistence of the Australians, a lot of projects that were being looked at by the British Air Ministry ended up taking priority anyway. Still, the maiden flight of what would become the Walrus finally took place on the 21st of June 1933 at Woolston, near Southampton, with Supermarine's chief test pilot, Captain Joseph Mutt Summers, at the controls. The first flight revealed no major problems, nor did early water handling trials, and confidence in the design grew quickly. Just 5 days later, on the 26th of June, the aircraft was publicly demonstrated at the Royal Air Force display at Hendon. Though it had barely logged a handful of flying hours, Summers was cleared to put the machine through a short series of maneuvers during the display. In doing so, the prototype's performance became one of the biggest surprises of the entire event. Although it appeared bulky and somewhat ungainly, the Seagull 5 proved capable of swift and nimble aerobatic maneuvers. Summers even managed to put it through a loop, which is something that one does not usually associate with the capabilities of a flying boat, but it did it. Following the Hendon display, the aircraft returned to Woolston, where Supermarine completed its internal company trials during the following weeks. Once these were complete, the prototype was then handed over for official evaluations. Responsibility now passed to the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment, or MAEE, which was located at Felixstowe. Over the next several months, the Seagull 5 was subjected to extensive testing. It was flown under a wide variety of conditions, including trials at different speeds, handling evaluations, and operations on rough seas. These tests allowed engineers and pilots to identify design features or handling traits that could be improved before the aircraft entered full production and service. Several adjustments would be made as a result. Among these was a slight 3-degree offset in the engine mounting, which was introduced to counteract the torque effect of the propeller. If you look at a top-down view of the design, you can clearly see this. Modifications were also made to parts of the hull to improve aerodynamic performance and hydrodynamic performance, particularly with planing for takeoff. Overall, however, the aircraft performed extremely well. A report issued by the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment on the 2nd of February 1934 praised its handling characteristics. The report noted that despite its relatively small size, the flying boat was exceptionally seaworthy, capable of operating safely even in rough sea conditions. It also highlighted the aircraft's excellent low-speed handling and its ability to take off and land in confined areas. No major issues or concerns were raised. With these positive evaluations, the Seagull 5 soon completed its experimental assessments, and by August of 1934, production orders began to follow. The first customer was, unsurprisingly, the Royal Australian Air Force, which placed an initial order for 24 airframes. Because the aircraft was intended for operation from warships, the British Royal Navy assisted in evaluating the design under realistic operational conditions. The prototype was taken aboard the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, where it underwent pre-service testing at sea. These trials attempted to replicate the kinds of operational and weather conditions that it would face in active military service. This was done mostly as a cost-saving measure, as it was cheaper for everyone involved to have the aircraft tested in British waters by the Royal Navy, rather than sending it over to the Australians, having the Australians test it, possibly find something wrong, and then have everything get fixed up again back in Britain. The Seagull 5 was thoroughly tested in strong winds, it conducted takeoff and landings among 6-foot waves, and it was taxied repeatedly in varying degrees of rough seas. Now, such demanding trials were necessary for any military flying boat, but especially for those intended to help defend such a vast and varied coastline as those found in Australia. They'd have to endure the cold and stormy conditions of the Southern Oceans and the Tasman Sea, the capricious seasons of the Indian Ocean, and, of course, the harsh tropics of Australia's northern coasts, which tended to alternate between being jellyfish-infested, shark-infested, or cyclone-infested, sometimes all three. Thankfully, in all of these tests, the aircraft performed exceptionally well. Naval aviators and ship crews alike were impressed by its ruggedness and seaworthiness, particularly the latter as it made operating the aircraft in general significantly less hazardous in poor weather. From this second set of extensive testing, only minor refinements were required. Among them were improvements to the wingtip stabilizing floats, which helped the aircraft plane more effectively on the water, and the addition of splash deflectors on the cabin windows to reduce spray during takeoff and landing. With these changes implemented, the prototype was then formally accepted into service with the British Fleet Air Arm on January 1st, 1935. But Rex, didn't you just say before that it was ordered by the Australians? Well, yes it was. But the prototype had performed so well by this point that the Royal Navy was now also interested, and putting this initial airframe into service immediately would help provide additional data to help refine the production models now being ordered by Australia and soon the Royal Navy itself. As such, the prototype received the serial number K4797 and it was delivered to the Royal Naval Air Station at Leon Solent. From there, it was soon assigned to the battleship HMS Nelson, which was preparing for a deployment to the West Indies. The decision to immediately place the prototype into active service would quickly prove its worth. Following a routine flight, the aircraft attempted to land on the sea with the undercarriage wheels still extended. When the wheels struck the water, they dug in immediately, causing the aircraft to pitch forward and flip over. Fortunately, and mostly owing to the Seagull's rugged construction, the crew escaped unharmed and the damage to the aircraft was relatively minor. But the incident was important, as it contributed to the development and implementation of two features that would later become almost universal in aviation: the undercarriage indicator light and the undercarriage warning horn, which alerts pilots if they attempt to land with the landing gear incorrectly configured. The prototype was soon repaired and returned to service, however its career would be short-lived. Not long afterwards, while operating at sea, the aircraft struck an anti-submarine barrier that had been laid across the water, and it ruptured the hull and sank rapidly. Once again, the crew escaped without injury, but the aircraft itself was lost. Thus ended the career of the first Seagull 5, an aircraft that would soon become far better known under a different name, the Supermarine Walrus. By the time the first prototype aircraft had been lost, the first production Seagulls were already leaving the factory. Deliveries to Australia began in 1935, and over the following 2 years, the Royal Australian Air Force would receive its full order, with the final aircraft being delivered in 1937. Most of these were based ashore at Point Cook in Victoria, where they became the principal aircraft of No. 1 Seaplane Training Flight. This unit was later reorganised and renumbered as No. 5 Squadron, with the Seagull forming the backbone of its operations. Compared to the prototype, there were only 2 other major changes found in the initial production model. Just before starting production, the aircraft's chief designer, R.J. Mitchell, visited the Admiralty and acquainted himself with the spaces and environments where his aircraft would be operating, chiefly being aboard a warship. The predominant takeaways for him was that the aircraft should adopt a folding wing design to be more space efficient, and be fitted with an autopilot system to aid in long-range reconnaissance flights. As such, wing folding mechanisms were installed, and some aircraft, though not all apparently, were equipped with a Sperry autopilot or Sperry gyroscopic stabilizer to assist with stability and navigation. Curiously though, despite keen interest by the British Royal Navy, the aircraft itself was adopted somewhat more slowly in its country of origin. The British Admiralty was initially reluctant to place an order. One of the primary concerns was the growing complexity of naval aviation logistics. Each additional aircraft type introduced into service required its own spare parts, specialized maintenance procedures, training programs, and supply arrangements. Naval planners therefore tried to avoid operating too many different types simultaneously, which is fair enough. However, when you look at the list of the varying types of aircraft operated by the Fleet Air Arm in the interwar years leading up to, and in fact during, the Second World War, you can see quite quickly that this plan somewhat fell by the wayside as they operated a multiplicity of types, including the Walrus. That was because, despite these reservations, the Seagull 5 ultimately proved too promising to ignore. Compared with the other aircraft serving similar roles aboard Royal Navy ships, particularly the Fairey Seal and the Hawker Osprey, the new design offered significant improvements in handling, seaworthiness, and overall capabilities. As a result, the Air Ministry approved an initial order for 12 aircraft in April 1935, and at roughly the same time, its official name was also changed. The Seagull 5 was redesignated as the Supermarine Walrus shortly before production aircraft began entering service. Now, the precise reasons for this change are not entirely clear, but the new name followed the Royal Navy's long-standing tradition of naming amphibious aircraft after marine animals. The most logical reason for the change in name that I can see, though source material does not outright confirm this, was that there were enough differences in the design of the Walrus compared to the previous iterations of the Seagull. This, however, flies in the face of previous Supermarine tradition, where you had different variants of an aircraft with the same name that had vastly different features in their design. Supermarine was a bit of an outlier when it came to this way of applying aircraft nomenclature, and I think the change from Seagull to Walrus was a smart one, and it reflected a broader trend of renaming aircraft designs as they changed that was seen in Britain and other countries. Anyway, moving on before I get tied into a segue on aircraft naming policies, the first production Walrus flew on the 18th of March 1936. By the end of the year, an additional 36 aircraft had been ordered. By that point, Walruses were already being deployed aboard Royal Naval warships. 9 vessels had received the type, and as older aircraft were gradually withdrawn from service, the Walrus began to assume a more prominent role in naval aviation. By August of 1939, shortly before the outbreak of war in Europe, 26 Royal Navy ships would be operating the Walrus, with a total of 45 distributed among them. The Royal Australian Navy was also operating the type in full, with its cruisers typically carrying 1 Walrus each. But even before the Second World War began, the aircraft already found itself involved, albeit in a limited way in military operations, during the Spanish Civil War. Between 1937 and 1939, Walruses carried out so-called neutrality patrols, monitoring shipping and enforcing the international non-intervention agreements that sought to limit outside involvement in the conflict. The optimistic naivety of British geopolitics of the time aside, these neutral missions did at least allow Walrus pilots and aircrews to get up a bit of operational experience before things got considerably more violent starting in 1939. In parallel during this period, production of the Walrus itself had rapidly expanded. By the end of 1936, as Britain reluctantly moved into a more aggressive phase of its rearmament plan, a substantial new order had been placed for 168 Walruses. These aircraft belonged to a slightly updated production group that was known as the L Series. The most significant difference was the installation of the improved Bristol Pegasus 6 engine, which produced up to 775 horsepower during takeoff. This production batch would also represent the first of a small number of Walruses that were also exported. 3 were delivered to New Zealand, 3 went to Ireland, and 2 went to Argentina, which intended to operate them from its training cruiser, which was appropriately named the ARA Argentina. The final pre-war production group became known as the P series, consisting of 50 additional aircraft. By this point, though, Supermarine was becoming increasingly occupied with other aircraft development projects, most notably the production of the Supermarine Spitfire, which the RAF was ordering rapidly in ever-growing numbers. With total Walrus orders now approaching 300 aircraft, which in interwar terms was a very large number, it was decided that production should be transferred to another manufacturer to free up space at Supermarine to focus on the Spitfire. This task was given to Saunders-Roe, a company with considerable experience in building flying boats. When Saunders-Roe took over production, only minor changes were introduced to the design. One small but welcome improvement was the replacement of the original all-metal tailwheel with a pneumatic tyre. The earlier design had transmitted vibrations directly into the hull during land operations, sometimes causing the entire aircraft to resonate like a sounding box. Rubber tyres had originally been omitted as it was felt that they would degrade too quickly with use at sea. However, complaints and pilot comfort eventually triumphed over this design change, and the new tyre greatly reduced the vibrations suffered by the crew, which made operations far more comfortable. Saunders-Roe would go on to build a large number of Supermarine Walruses during the Second World War. In 1941, the company introduced a modified version known as the Walrus Mark II, which featured a wooden hull instead of the earlier metal design. This was part of a broader government initiative to conserve the use of aluminium for high-priority aircraft such as the Spitfire. Before this change was introduced, Saunders Roe had already produced 270 of the original Walrus designs. Production of the wooden-hulled Walrus 2 continued throughout the war, and by the end of production in 1944, 190 of these had been completed. Due to their less resilient construction, most of these aircraft were used for training the crews that would eventually operate the Walrus Mark I in active military service. As you might expect, although the Walrus entered service in 1935, the aircraft would not see its most significant activities until the outbreak of the Second World War. By that point, parts of the design was already approaching a decade in age. Yet despite this, the aircraft remained a common sight aboard the warships of the Royal Navy. Hundreds were in active service, and when war came, they would be called upon like the rest. During the opening months of the conflict, however, the Walrus saw relatively little action. The first 7 months of the war were a quiet period, as they were for many British aircraft during the so-called Phoney War. With no large-scale coastal operations yet underway, and with the Kriegsmarine initially presenting only limited direct threats, the Royal Navy largely employed its shipborne aircraft in the trade protection and patrol roles. One of the earliest major naval engagements of the war, the Battle of the River Plate in December 1939, did involve ships that normally carried walruses. Both HMS Exeter and HMS Achilles were equipped to operate the aircraft. However, Achilles did not have her walrus embarked at the time of the battle. Exeter did carry hers, but after suffering severe damage and fires during the engagement, the aircraft had to be jettisoned overboard. Despite this early anticlimax, the Walrus would soon find itself in far more active circumstances. In early 1940, during the Norwegian campaign, the aircraft finally had the opportunity to demonstrate its usefulness in wartime operations. Its performance during the campaign proved valuable enough that the Royal Navy created a dedicated Walrus unit, No. 701 Squadron, which operated 6 Walruses from Harstad in northern Norway. During a short period, from the 19th of May to the 7th of June 1940, these aircraft carried out an intense series of missions. In less than 3 weeks, the Walruses flew approximately 250 sorties, conducting reconnaissance, patrols, and artillery spotting missions in support of British forces operating in the area. Just before the British withdrawal from Norway, 5 of the aircraft were even used in a strike against a German-occupied village. Despite the risks involved and light anti-aircraft fire, all 5 would return safely. However, the campaign was not without loss. 701 Squadron's 6th Walrus was sunk at her moorings by a near miss from a bomb. Then, on the 18th of May 1940, a Walrus launched from the heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire encountered a German Heinkel HE-111 bomber during a night patrol. The encounter took place at around 2 o'clock in the morning, and the Walrus was no match for the bomber's defensive armaments. During the engagement, the aircraft was badly damaged and eventually crashed into the Malangen Ford. The pilot was killed in the crash, while the observer and gunner survived the initial impact. Local Norwegian civilians later rowed out to the crash site and rescued the 2 surviving airmen from the freezing waters. Sadly, the gunner later died from injuries sustained during the engagement, but the observer survived. Devonshire's remaining Walrus would later on play a more successful role. On the 9th of November 1940, it participated in the destruction of the Vichy French submarine Poncelet in the Gulf of Guinea. As 1940 progressed, various Walrus units would see more and more action. But combat was not what earned the Walrus the fame and respect for which it's remembered today. Indeed, it was quite the opposite. The Walrus became an unexpected air-sea rescue success story. In the summer of 1940, during the early weeks of the Battle of Britain, fighter pilots who bailed out over the English Channel or the North Sea often had little chance of survival. Even when they escaped their aircraft safely, they were frequently left drifting in cold waters with no immediate means of rescue. Despite the fact that Britain was an island nation, and despite the fact that Fighter Command knew well in advance that a lot of home defense would take place above the English Channel, there was no organized air-sea rescue system in place. Recovery depended largely on patrol boats or small coastal launch crafts. Depending on where the pilot landed in the sea, it could take hours for those craft to reach them, if they reach them at all. Recovery depended largely on chance. As a result, many pilots who had successfully escaped their downed aircraft after ditching in the sea or parachuting into the water either drowned or died of exposure before help could reach them. In stark contrast, the Germans had established the world's first dedicated air-sea rescue service way back in 1935, the Seenotdienst. I briefly mentioned it several years ago in a video on the Heinkel 59, and a fellow history buff on YouTube, Callum, produced an excellent video on the specialized rescue boys that became a lifeline for the downed Luftwaffe pilots. The absence of dedicated air-sea rescue operations quickly became a big problem for RAF's fighter command. Britain had a limited number of trained fighter pilots at any given point, and these were spread over many operational squadrons. Replacing them effectively was a slow and difficult process. A pilot lost to the sea was therefore not merely a personal tragedy, but also a loss of experience that the RAF could ill afford. It was in this context that the role of the Supermarine Walrus was dramatically changed, and it was thanks to the initiative of a young man from New Zealand, one Flight Lieutenant Russell Aitken. In July 1940, Aitken was stationed at RAF Gosport, where he regularly witnessed dogfights taking place over the Channel. From his vantage point, he could often see aircraft ditching into the sea or being shot down and their pilots forced to parachute into the waters. Watching rescue launches, which were small boats launched from the shore, struggle to reach them in time, he was reminded of his own experience of being unceremoniously dumped into the sea. Back in February 1940, he had been lost overboard from the carrier HMS Ark Royal, as she had taken evasive action to avoid a Luftwaffe air attack. He was lucky as he was quickly picked up by a following destroyer, but even so, the experience had been unpleasant, wet, and bitterly cold. It didn't take many days of observation for Aitken to realize that the current rescue strategy was insufficient, and, being a skilled pilot, he made a proposal to his commanding officer. Gosport had some Supermarine Walrus amphibians on hand. They handled well on the water and were relatively roomy. Instead of relying entirely on boats, they could have these aircraft stationed offshore and respond immediately when a pilot came down in the water. With permission from his superiors, Aitken began operating a Walrus in precisely this way, launching from the waters near the Isle of Wight. He was soon joined by a pair of pilots operating Walruses from the Royal Naval Air Station at Ford, and they formed a semi-official air-sea rescue unit. Though simple in practice, their mission was often fraught with danger. The waters of the English Channel were rarely calm, and landing a seaplane in open sea conditions demanded considerable skill. Walrus crews frequently had to bring their aircraft down among waves, floating wreckage, and sometimes even burning fuel on the surface of the sea. Yet despite these dangers, the aircraft proved exceptionally well suited to the task. The Walrus's strengthened hull and excellent low-speed handling allowed it to alight in conditions that would have been dangerous for many other seaplanes. Once on the water, the crew would haul in the exhausted airmen, often suffering from injuries, shock, or severe cold, and then take off again and bringing them back safely to land. The method proved remarkably effective. Over the course of just a few weeks during the summer of 1940, Aitken personally rescued at least 35 pilots from the Channel, both British and German alike. Now, though it's rarely mentioned, this actually ruffled a few feathers. Although international law required belligerents to rescue shipwrecked personnel whenever possible, the law had not been updated to include airmen from downed aircraft. Though the majority supported the rescue of downed airmen as a natural extension of this law, some opposed the practice as an unnecessary risk, as a rescue plane is, on the whole, more fragile than a rescue boat. These legal debates, as they usually do, took place far away from the events they were actually squabbling about, so most people either ignored them or weren't even aware of them in the first place. Adhering to the traditions of the sea, Aitken did not discriminate, and he continued to rescue downed pilots regardless of nationality. Russell Aitken was just 26 years old when he flew these rescue missions, but compared to many of those he saved, he was almost a greybeard. The men flying the fighters in the Battle of Britain were remarkably young. RAF pilots he rescued averaged only about 20 years of age. Their German opponents were older, usually in their mid-20s, but still young. And to a young, frightened, half-drowned airman, the sight of a walrus bobbing into view would have brought indescribable relief. The significance of these impromptu rescue operations extended far beyond the individuals involved. They demonstrated that aircraft such as the Walrus could reach survivors far more quickly than surface vessels, and could operate directly in the areas where fighting was taking place. As a result, the RAF began to organize air-sea rescues on a far more systematic basis. The small, improvised operations carried out by Aitken and others would ultimately lead to the development of the RAF Air-Sea Rescue Service, which expanded rapidly during the war. And so, while the Walrus had originally been designed as a naval reconnaissance and gunnery spotting aircraft, it was in this unexpected role, patiently circling the cold waters of the sea in search of survivors, that it earned its most enduring reputation. But apart from its role as a guardian angel above the sea, the Walrus would see a wide range of service during the Second World War in general. As the Battle of Britain ended and Germany turned increasingly towards submarine warfare, the Walrus found itself assisting and supplementing its larger cousins. German U-boats began attacking Allied convoys with increasing intensity, attempting to cut Britain's vital supply lines. In response, the Walrus was used to help patrol coastal waters and convoy routes. Although it lacked the range of larger patrol flying boats, such as the Short Sunderland or the Consolidated Catalina, those aircraft were available only in limited numbers at the time. The Walrus, by contrast, was relatively numerous. To increase its usefulness, temporary seaplane bases were established around the British coastline. From these bases, the aircraft could patrol wider areas of sea, assisting in the detection of submarines and surface raiders. During this period, an unusual experimental modification was also attempted. One Walrus, aircraft serialed L2271, was fitted with a 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose. The intent was to give the aircraft enough firepower to attack small German coastal vessels and fast raiding ships, or even surfaced U-boats. The usual forward gunner station was removed, and the cannon was fixed in a forward position and fired by the pilot. In theory, it seemed like a powerful addition, but in practice, the results were far less promising. During testing, it quickly became clear that the blast from the cannon temporarily blinded the pilot, particularly when firing during low-level attack runs in poor visibility. This was even more problematic during nighttime tests that simulated attacks on a surface submarine, with the repeated muzzle flash of the cannon having the effect of a series of near-continuous flashbang grenades going off just a few feet in front of the pilot's face. Needless to say, this was considered an unacceptable drawback. The experiment was abandoned, and no further Walruses were equipped with heavy cannon armament. The aircraft would instead continue the war, performing the duties for which it was best suited: reconnaissance, patrol work, and rescuing downed pilots from the sea. By 1941, German surface raiders were at the height of their activities, yet even during this period, Walruses often found themselves unable to take part in the action. During the hunt for the German battleship Bismarck, Walrus aircraft were present aboard several of the British ships involved in the pursuit. In theory, they could have played an important role in reconnaissance. However, circumstances prevented their use. By the time of the decisive stages of the operation, the Walruses had either been damaged by heavy weather, jettisoned for safety, or could not be launched at all due to the incredibly poor sea conditions. Nevertheless, the aircraft still managed to make valuable contributions elsewhere during this time. Between March and December of 1941, Walruses played key roles in the destruction of 8 enemy vessels and the capture of 3 others, most of them auxiliary raiders and supply ships operating across the northern Atlantic. The aircraft also saw considerable activity in the Mediterranean Sea, where Walruses operated from both Royal Navy and Australian warships against the Italian fleet. It was here that one of the major drawbacks of using catapult-launched aircraft became increasingly obvious. Launching a seaplane from a warship was a relatively straightforward process. You take it out the hangar, you stick it on the catapult ramp, you fire. Recovering it again was often far more difficult. The aircraft had to land on the water nearby, after which the ship would be forced to slow down or even stop completely, while a slow crane lifted the aircraft back on board. In the middle of a naval operation, this could leave the ship temporarily vulnerable. In the relatively compact naval theatre of the Mediterranean, in terms of size compared to the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans, this would result in several cases where walruses could not be recovered by their motherships. For example, during one operation against the Italian naval base at Genoa, 2 walruses from the cruiser Sheffield, instead of returning safely to their own cruiser, were instead forced to land alongside the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. In both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, despite their intended purpose, walruses rarely played decisive roles during major naval engagements. More often, their usefulness emerged in coastal and inshore operations instead. Here, they performed a wide range of fairly similar duties, supporting ground forces, observing naval bombardments of shore targets, conducting reconnaissance of beachheads and future landing sites, and assisting with the amphibious landings themselves. At sea, however, the aircraft's most valuable role increasingly became air-sea rescue, ironically the one thing it had not been originally designed for. Time and again, downed pilots found themselves staring up at the distinctive silhouette of a walrus circling overhead. By the middle of 1941, the chunky shape of the walrus had become more or less synonymous with air-sea rescue for the RAF. When it came to its other operational duties, the fortunes of the walrus changed quickly following the middle of 1941. The outbreak of war in the Pacific at the end of the year began to change the strategic environment in which the walrus would operate. Large naval formations were now more commonly built around aircraft carriers, with groups of cruisers and destroyers providing escort. In these formations, the ships could rely on the carrier's aircraft for reconnaissance and spotting duties, rather than carrying their own catapult seaplanes. Although this was not, of course, universally the case, the growing dominance of carrier-borne aircraft gradually reduced the importance of ship-borne catapult seaplanes. As a result, 1942 effectively marked the final year in which the Walrus could be considered an active combat aircraft. Aside from the doctrinal shift, several technological developments also contributed to this change. Advances in radar increasingly replaced the gunnery spotting role that the Walrus had once performed. At the same time, improvements in anti-aircraft defenses made low-altitude reconnaissance extremely dangerous for slow aircraft like the Walrus. The Walrus, sturdy as it was simply not built to withstand the utter hail of bullets that would be sent by a well-defended carrier task force. Removing catapult aircraft from warships also had practical advantages. Without the aircraft and its associated equipment, a ship could eliminate as much as 30 tons of highly flammable aviation fuel from its stores, and it also freed up space that could be then used for additional anti-aircraft guns, which became an increasingly important defensive measure, particularly in the Pacific theatre. Now, none of this meant that the Walrus disappeared from combat operations overnight, but from 1943 onwards its roles gradually diminished. One of the last recorded uses of the type in its traditional naval role came in November of 1944, when the battleship King George V used a walrus for artillery spotting during the bombardment of Milos Island. By this stage, however, the aircraft had largely transitioned into air-sea rescue duties exclusively. Within the British Pacific Fleet, walruses continued to operate in this capacity until the end of the war. By mid-May 1945, at least one carrier in every task group was required to carry a walrus specifically for air-sea rescue operations. An improved successor, the Supermarine Sea Otter, had originally been intended to replace the walrus. The Sea Otter incorporated several improvements and entered service in 1942. However, despite these refinements, the basic concept of a catapult-launched seaplane was already rapidly becoming obsolete. Although an entirely capable aircraft in its own right, fewer than 300 Sea Otters were built, and they never fully replaced the Walrus in active service. In the end, they ended up performing much of the same duties alongside them: maritime patrol and air-sea rescue. Supermarine briefly attempted to continue the lineage after the war with a new aircraft, the inventively named Supermarine Seagull. Yes, that is the same name that the Walrus had originally been given. Work had begun during the final years of the war, and the design was considerably more advanced than its predecessor. It was sleeker and far more aerodynamic, and was powered by a beefy 1800 horsepower Rolls-Royce Griffon. Why it was developed in the first place, though, is up for debate, as by the late 1940s and definitely by the 1950s, it had become clear that a new technology was rapidly taking over the role once performed by amphibious aircraft loaded on warships. That was the helicopter. With its intended role quickly supplanted, the development of the Seagull was quickly abandoned, and the two completed prototypes were scrapped at some point in 1952. Following the Second World War, the Walrus entered a gradual retirement phase. The Royal Navy had largely withdrawn it from service by 1946, but the aircraft continued to fly with other operators. The Royal Canadian Navy received several examples, while even the French Navy also operated a small number of Walruses themselves. The longest military operator, though, proved to be Argentina, which continued operating Walruses from the cruiser ARA Argentina until at least 1958. In the post-war world, there were even attempts to find civilian uses for the aircraft. One of the more unusual ventures came from the United Whalers Company of London, which purchased 6 Walruses for use in its Antarctic whaling operations. The aircraft performed successfully during the 1946-47 season, though the experiment was never repeated. All 6 aircraft were then laid up and eventually scrapped around 1950. On the other side of the world, another operator, Amphibious Airways of Rabaul, of all places, purchased several former Australian Walruses and used them for charter flying among the islands of the South Pacific all the way up until 1954. The final Flying Walrus had a particularly colourful career. Originally built as the 4th production Seagull 5, the aircraft passed through several owners and roles over the years, including sightseeing flights over the Great Barrier Reef during the early 1960s. It was later restored to flying condition and even entered in the 1969 England to Australia air race. Unfortunately, the aircraft was damaged during a landing in Indonesia and subsequently damaged more during a storm. It was eventually returned to Australia, but it was in such poor condition that it was never brought back to flight-worthy status ever again. With that, the official flying career of the Supermarine Walrus at last came to an end. Today, 4 Walruses survive. 3 are preserved in the United Kingdom and 1 in Australia. 3 are on public display, while 1 remains in a private collection. The Walrus was a remarkable and important aircraft. Unlike so many that flew in the Second World War, it was not immortalized by technical importance, or by the specific deeds of a single struggle, or by fighting in the great aerial campaigns that dominate the aeronautical history of 6 years that mostly catalogue death and destruction. Instead, it's fondly remembered as a machine that spent much of its wartime career saving lives, which is a much better legacy by far. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. It's been a while since I've done a long video like this, and there are more on the way. They just take a bit more time to produce than the rest. Now, in between, I will be putting up a bunch of shorter videos which have been voted on, along with my new A to Z series, the inaugural video of which received some very positive feedback, which I'm glad to see. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Peter Seifert and Michael Garber, who are the newest members of this special group. New topic votes will go live for patrons and YouTube members over the coming week, so please keep an eye out for those. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the pinned comment below, and if you're new here and you enjoy what you see, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. But for now, that is all. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.